Hello, welcome to part 2 of chapter 11 of Common Childhood Onset Genetic Disorders. This is going to be a much shorter section. A lot of it is going to be a review of what I know y'all are already familiar with the pathophysiology components of diabetes type 1 and asthma. But these are the complex disorders, and those two are the primary ones we're going to be dealing with today. And the complex disorders have a polygenic input, and they require both a genetic and an environmental input for expression. The genetic input increases the person's susceptibility to forming these autoimmune disorders. So the environmental trigger or triggers interact with the increased susceptibility of that individual to promote the expression of the disorder. So here's a picture of polygenic input in diabetes type 1. Chromosome 6 is largely involved in the development of diabetes type 1, but you can see there are other chromosomes that have components to that disorder. So we know it's autoimmune, okay, in which insulin-producing cells in the pancreas are destroyed and insulin is no longer synthesized, which leads to chronic hyperglycemia. Over here is a offspring potential of a parent, a carrier father with a mutated gene, and then the carrier mother, resulting in a 50-50 chance in the offspring of having the mutated gene. Okay, so it's an autoimmune disease, one of inflammation and immune action excess, in which the immune system no longer recognizes the person's own cells. So it no longer recognizes self, and it starts to attack their own tissue. And self cells are attacked as if they were the invading organisms. So again, the predisposition to developing an autoimmune response leading to type 1 diabetes is inherited. So autoimmune diseases do run in families. The expression of autoimmune disorders does require an additional environmental input. Okay, so you have an individual with a predisposition. If they don't have that environmental trigger occur in their lifetime, they may never get it. Or maybe it doesn't happen until they're much, much older. Type 1 diabetes typically manifests in childhood because children are exposed to so many viruses, particularly the Coxsackie virus, that is a big culprit for being a trigger for type 1 diabetes. But type 1 diabetes has been diagnosed in older adults. I worked with an individual who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 35. But most commonly, yes, it happens in children. Autoimmune disorders is higher in some families, but doesn't follow a pattern for a single gene inheritance. And as I've mentioned, it usually develops in childhood. Okay, genetic contributions. Susceptibility to the development of type 1 autoimmune problem, again, is partially determined by the inheritance of certain human leukocyte antigen genes, HLA genes, that code for a specific tissue. The most closely associated tissue types are the HLA-DR and HLA-DQ. So the cell surface, which again is human leukocyte antigen, and the cell surface receptor for foreign or self-antigens are encoded on the HLA region of chromosome 6 at the short arm P21.3. So unless at least one environmental event occurs at a particular time, the risk does not lead to disease expression. As I've mentioned, you've got to have both components occurring for the expression to manifest. So the risk for developing the disease is 1 in 20 for people who have one parent with type 1 diabetes or another autoimmune disorder. Like they say, if you have one autoimmune disorder, you're at risk for other autoimmune disorders. You're more at risk than the general population of getting another autoimmune disorder such as diabetes. So people with this tissue type are also at risk for other types of autoimmune diseases. Okay, so if you have diabetes type 1, then they need to understand what signs and symptoms are for other autoimmune disorders that they have an increased risk for. Okay, environmental contributions. Obesity and a sedentary lifestyle do not increase the risk for type 1 diabetes. We know obesity and sedentary lifestyle play a role in development of type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is actually associated with an autosomal dominant disorder. And of course, obesity helps to trigger that onset for that. But the most common, as I've mentioned, for the development of diabetes type 1 is a viral infection, such as mumps, rubella, and the Coxsackie virus infection, which many children are exposed to. That triggers that autoimmune destruction of the pancreatic beta cells. So a little recap on pathophysiology of diabetes. I know y'all are all aware of this. We've got that invasion of the pancreatic beta cells that destroy it. And the internal mechanisms make more viruses by breaking and entering the cell's DNA. So the infected cell expresses some viral proteins on its surface. The white blood cells recognize that viral signal on the infected cell's surface and exert that toxic reaction against the infected cell to prevent the infection from spreading throughout the body. And white blood cells, rather than the viruses, directly kill or damage these cells. And so, again, the immune system is recognizing, does not recognize self as self and sees it as an antigen, and it damages and destroys the beta cells, and the islets become fibrotic and non-functional over time. You're all familiar with the signs and symptoms of type 1 diabetes. Here they are for you to review. And long-term complications, we're all aware of diabetes leading to atherosclerosis, heart disease, CVA, high blood pressure, coronary artery disease, gastroparesis. Again, long-term complications from poor management. Ultimately, the cardiac complications leads to an MI. We know about the neuropathy and nephropathy, kidney failure, the wound healing complications, and then, of course, their increased risk for infection. Okay, so that's the skinny on diabetes type 1. And asthma, we're going to move on to, is also a chronic inflammatory disease of the airways, characterized by intermittent periods of reversible airflow obstruction. So intermittent episodes are called asthma attacks, and it is the result of three actions. We have constriction of the smooth muscles surrounding the smaller airways, we have swelling of the mucous membranes lining the airways, and we have excessive mucus production that plug the airways. So most common type of asthma is atopic asthma, which is a hypersensitivity reaction or allergic response involving the release of immunoglobulin E. And asthma can have any one or even all three actions occurring at the same time. Asthma often presents in more than one family member. Genetic contributions. It is also polygenic, just like diabetes. 50 to 100 genomic variations are associated with asthma development. Some have greater influences than others. Some are more specific within racial and ethnic groups, but most are located in the gene regions coding for proteins involved in regular inflammatory reactions and immune responses. The genetically driven increased airway responsiveness and increased production of inflammatory mediators. So environmental contributions to asthma: exposure to inhalation irritants such as smoke, chemicals, cold air, fine airborne particles, even exercise, microorganisms. Ingestion of aspirin or other NSAIDs can be a contributor to asthma. So we're all familiar with the pathophysiology of asthma. Okay, we have that constriction and the narrowing of the airways. We have the inflammatory mediators causing airway swelling, and then that reduces airflow, increases the work of breathing, and impairs that oxygen delivery. So signs and symptoms, we've all are familiar with this and have witnessed this, most likely. That chest tightness, difficulty breathing, wheezing, okay, and that increased mucus production, shortness of breath. And then during attacks, of course, we've got decreased oxygenation, cyanosis, okay. Oh, and that is, oopsie, I guess that is the very last slide. So that was a really quick recap. And so again, read your book on that And because this was just a sort of a general, this was a general overview. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.